You can't really understand sword design as well as medieval art without understanding the religious work that went into designing the images that even now inspire us and make us hold our breath. The story of Christian and medieval art really begins at the Seventh Ecumenical Council convened by Empress Irene in 787 to resolve the iconoclastic controversy. You see, for over a century before that date, there was a controversy in that some versions of Christianity loved depicting the saints and what is shown in the holy texts. Others really thought that depicting the saints, especially God, was wrong. It is an idolatry and more akin to the pagans rather than the true righteous path. So the controversy led to a point where we even had wars over the depictions of the saints, and a lot of the Greek, Roman, and Christian art was defaced. And you can see those defacements right now in museums, especially if you took an art history class. Now, in 787, the church decided that depiction of holy images was okay because it is a veneration, proskinesis, as opposed to worshipping latria. The reason for that is a theological one, and it's kind of cool. So, a depiction of a holy person is not an image of that person the way we would think of as a photograph. No, it was considered to be a window to the divine. Creation of an icon was a religious practice that is similar to God made flesh. So the logical chain in admitting holy images was, if word becomes flesh, so the creation of the holy image is the window to the divine. The icon is holy not because it's holy in itself, but only insofar that it leads to the divine. The door to your house is not your house, but it is a necessary step for you to arrive at home. Conventionally, the process of creating an icon is in itself a worship-like procedure. It is a devotional practice. The creation of the icon follows roughly the steps of Genesis. The preparation of the blank ground with subsequent beginning with dark colors moving all the way to light then gold, and then the highlights shows the book of Genesis. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving on the waters. The last thing that is painted on the icon is the eyes of the saint, as well as the highlights, symbolizing breath of life and the fulfillment of prophetic vision. That is, light and Word of God is coming into being. And there's no real any other way of painting a traditional icon. And it has been like that all the way up until the Renaissance. There are other cool things about an icon that an appreciator of medieval art has to keep in mind. One of them is perspective. Perspective on a traditional icon is always weird, and if you don't know what to look at, you will think that the artist was bad at art. But in fact, he was really, really good and very, very, very well read. The perspective does not converge on the horizon inside the image. It is, in fact, reverses and converges on the viewer, you. That's why buildings are so weird in the background of almost every icon. Now, in preparing for this presentation, I've read a bunch of counter-arguments. One of them says that it's simple convenience or compositional necessity that required the icon painter to paint buildings weird. That does not hold water if we know the texts on which iconography is based on. And here we can go back to ancient Greece. You see early theologians, for example, St. Augustine, as well as later ones like Thomas Aquinas, were really, really well versed in Greek philosophy. You can argue that the crowning achievement of Greek philosophy is Christianity itself. That's why on the Cathedral of Chartres or Eastern Orthodox icons you have the venerable pagans represented. Aristotle, you can see Plato, you can see Archimedes, and last but not least, Pythagoras. And Pythagoras is key. In ancient Greece, you had the cult of Pythagoras, who thought the world to be rational and mathematical. In fact, all the way to the 17th century, people thought that the orbits of the planets corresponded to the sphere that could be built around a Platonic solid, and starting with the cube, then tetrahedron, then dodecahedron, all the other planets organized like that. And it's only in the late 17th century that we found out it's not the case. So for 1,000 years, Christians thought that the Pythagorean way of looking at reality is a way of knowing God. And if you look at what happens when you paint in a holy image, reverse perspective, it starts looking very similar to a representation of a four-dimensional cube. Right? It's right here. We're going to insert it right here. Now, it is all intentional. Why? Because if you're representing divine, you're representing it. You're not showing it how it is, but you're giving a window to it. A little bit of funhouse window, nonetheless. So it is intentional. The stylization of the human figure is also intentional. You're not painting the true Saint Matthew. You're painting an idealized form of the saint as he is in the divine realm, because you're supposed to arrive there through the icon. The Council of Nicaea also had an instructional purpose to iconography. That is, a lot of people can't read, especially Latin or Greek, but they somehow have to internalize the meaning of biblical texts. So in that respect, maybe a little bit degrading to the icon, but it does have a comic book-like purpose, a picture book. Now, even there, the high intellectual work of early theologians shows itself very well. If you look at, for example, the icon of Christ walking on water, you also see a boat somewhere on the water. And in that boat, you have the apostles or sometimes something else, depending on the region and the time. You see, that boat is simultaneously a hint to the passage that with me you will become the fisher of men. It is also Noah's ark. So as Noah was walking in water to save humanity in a boat, so is Christ walking on water to save humanity. And this simultaneity of texts and meanings is very important to the creation of true cathedral ecclesiastic art. St. Augustine has several ways you can reason about holy texts. One is historical, literal. So when, let's say, we read Moses is leaving Egypt, we read, well, they actually left Egypt. Cool. There's an moral interpretation. Let's say the famous passage, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. There's a moral lesson to it, and it's pretty obvious. We can contemplate what could be the implications, but we know it's a moral lesson. There's allegorical. You can see Jonah to be representing something allegorically, but the new introduction that St. Augustine had is anagogical reasoning. Anagogical sometimes is interpreted to be a type of allegorical reasoning. Other scholars don't. And please, 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 Catholic theologians, don't chop my head off, because I'm talking about this in a very condensed manner. Anagogical reasoning has to do with secrets revealed about your soul or your soul's destination. See, early in Christianity, a big problem was already discovered. And it's discovered because the story of the Bible has an end, but we live outside of the events that biblical texts describe. So how do we extract lessons of deep devotion from this to us? Because we're separated by hundreds of years. St. Augustine says that some texts are outside of time. That is, time for God or in the divine realm is happening all at once and eternal. That's the notion of infinity that medievals had. So the great flood and Noah is happening at the same time as Christ walking in water and at the same time as we're living now. So the ark is the same as the church that saves us, and only through the church you can, at the end of days, find your salvation. The idea that everything is happening technically at the same time allows for the narrative structure of the creation of icon to create very specific meanings from texts that everyone has read before for a long, long time, just by combining the references. If you're looking for something stylish for personal use or a gift, I recommend gentle bands. They will fit a smart or formal environment as well as the nitty-gritty operations in the workshop. Gentle bands are very affordable and don't sacrifice any notion of fashion. And if you check them out, I'm sure you'll find a ring that suits you or your loved one. Gentle band rings are durable, so if you're working with machinery or laying bricks, they will withstand the abuse. And did I mention they have tons of styles? So whatever your personality is, I'm pretty sure you will find something that suits you. And if you're married and work, for example, as a welder, you might not want to bring your expensive gold ring to work. Gentle bands is a great substitute where you signal that you're married, but the ring you have will not be damaged too much by weld sparks or grinding dust. And if you like this kind of content, Gentle Bands and other sponsors like it support us making these videos, so why don't you hop over to gentlebands.com and find something that you like. Anagogical reasoning also helps us with a very, very cool thing. And for a moment, my dear listener, I might sound like Jordan Peterson, and sometimes Jordan Peterson does sound like a middle schooler who just discovered this thing and made it his entire shtick. I assure you, I'm not doing that. Anagogical reasoning allows us to create new art that is not strictly within the canon, but place it inside the devotional canon. That's why you have saints that are depicted outside of the Council of Nicaea. Now, our story is St. George. And when I was asked to make the hero, I was asked to make it on the theme of St. George. But we have a problem. I'm a modern sword maker, but I'm asked to execute it in a Gothic style. That means I had to completely put all my knowledge of Western art into one box and cut the box at the exact time, approximately the Renaissance, and not be influenced by anything after that, which is difficult to do, and that's why I had to read and reread the context of creating devotional art. The cool thing about this story of St. George, it's one of the early Christian myths or stories or parables, however you prefer, that directly mirrors ancient Greek mythology. Here's an example. Ancient Greek mythology, you have Hercules, you have Perseus, whatever. The demigod, usually the hero, which is the definition of a hero, a demigod, is asked by a king or someone or as a form of atonement to eliminate one of the Chthonian monsters. The Chthonian monsters come from the beginning, the creation of the earth, where gods and titans gave birth to all kinds of ugly beings that are pestering the world. And a good representation of Greek myths, or rather rereading, is Stephen Fry series of books. They're just wonderful and I recommend them. And Stephen Fry, as a scholar of literature, points out that the gods had a task of eliminating all this primordial evil to lay bare the path of men. So the story of St. George roughly follows the Greek myth. However, in the Christian context, we can't really appeal to the hero being divine by virtue of birth. That is over, that is paganism. So St. George is shown to be a hero through faith. And we have a shifting paradigm that follows the rough narrative. So the story goes, in Syria, in the later stages of the Roman Empire, a kingdom is pestered by a dragon. The dragon breathes all kinds of poison. He lives by the swamp, and he's starting to eat the peasants. The peasants eventually start bringing sheep to the dragon to prevent him from destroying the fields. The dragon is greedy and asks for women, so now virgins are being sent to the dragon. The dragon is satisfied for a little bit, but then it comes the turn of the princess. Now the king, of course, princess, has to put a stop to it and recruits St. George to slay the dragon. And St. George, being a righteous warrior, demonstrates to us, the reader, what can be achieved through faith. That's the rough compendium of what the story of St. George is about. But the story of St. George in anagogical reasoning, right, is not only about St. George. It's supposed to be about us, what kind of things we can accomplish through faith. Right? And please, dear viewer, if I sound like a proselytizing preacher, I'm just giving respect to a beautiful tradition that has been passed to us from, let's say, 5th century AD all the way to modern day, and I'm treating it with absolute respect. And plus, you can't really understand even modern literature like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings without knowing these things. J.R. Tolkien was writing to C.S. Lewis specifically about this kind of motif in their writing. So let's proceed with the sword. Now, usually when you're creating an icon, you have to refer it to the New Testament and to Christ himself. If you look at the imagery that I'm creating on the hero, you don't see a cross anywhere. Well, one of the reasons is if you look at churches, let's say the 8th century all the way to 14th, 15th century, the church itself is already the shape of the cross, right? So here the sword is already, as a frame, depicting that without showing. So that theme is settled. On one side, I'm depicting the classical St. George slaying the dragon. Can never go wrong with classics, and it's a great, great, great way to exercise my engraving skill as well as my imagination of how that would look in deep relief on metal. On the other side, I'm showing, and this is a little bit of my invention for this project, is the princess as if she's already captured by the dragon. That is outside of standard iconography, but I'm a modern person living in modern time, and I can allow myself, if I treat the stylistic parameters and ecclesiastical parameters very well, to create a little bit of my own retelling invention. It's a foreboding image, right? Now, there are difficulties in executing a project like that. I've already explained in part the conceptual difficulty, that is, I have to follow a specific canon and I have to maintain a certain train of thought. It is not just slapping images here and here and here and now the sword is impressive. No, we don't do this at That Works. This is, other channels do it. We and our viewers are intelligent human beings who love art and love literature. So this sword is a piece of literature. Partially my authorship, but at the same time, I'm working with the parameters of an icon. An icon is kind of anti-art. See, the artist depicts something that the artist feels is the case. The creation of a medieval icon, you eliminate the ego. It's an almost Buddhist moment, in a sense. You are devoting your skill to the creation of this window to divinity. So that is the kind of intellectual work, before I even put a hammer to steel, that I have to do in designing it. In designing a project like this, I spend more time at the sketchbook than I do actually forging the sword. The physical constraints of the object are, for example, in order to create these panels that are the icons themselves on the blade, I have to forge weld medium carbon steel in the location rather than using the Mosaic Damascus that's the rest of the blade. And there's a scientific reason for that. See, when you forge out Damascus, right, you stretch it, stretch it, stretch it, your boundaries, basically alloy boundaries that you created between the 15 and 20 and 80 CRV, grow carbides along it. And as you stretch it, the carbides stretch with it. So if your layers go this way, it's easy, relatively, to carve it. But if you carve against it, like on a tree stump, every hit hits a carbide layer. Now, that is a natural process of Mosaic Damascus, but I don't need to be carving on Mosaic Damascus. If I etch it, the etching of the Damascus itself will interfere with the design I have for the pictorial depiction. So I forge welded a piece of 1045 there, right? Now, another problem with creating swords like that is the size. This is the longest Mosaic Damascus sword that I have done so far. It is very possible that I'll make a bigger one. I don't see necessity for it. And the third major constraint of the parameter is the price. I am using rubies, I'm using gemstones, I'm using silver and gold, and the price of those things fluctuate. If you budget to work this week on a handle and you buy the silver thinking that it's last week's prices, you're out of pocket, you're poor all of a sudden. So that's another constraint. Your precious materials have to satisfy a budget, and not only that, your precious materials have to satisfy the intended meaning. It's very easy to just randomly put gold everywhere on your project, and to some people who like that kind of stuff, that is appealing. It is not appealing to me because it's creating differences without necessity, and since the project has to be executed in a very specific style, imitating a very specific time, I can't allow myself to replace good design and thought with gaudiness. So I use silver without gold plating because silver is a pure material, and that's the part of the handle that will come into contact with your hand. And honestly, gold in ecclesiastical iconography depicts divine light, so I saved the gold for the halo of St. George because that's its meaning. And putting gold on the handle in this context would have been quite inappropriate given the themes depicted on the handle. Another complexity of a project like this is the time constraint. I've mentioned way early in the video that this sword took me several years. Well, I completed the first version when the handle was made out of mammoth ivory. It was great. However, the client did not like it. He wanted the hero to be more like the heretic, which, saying it now, sounds like a little bit of an inside joke on the part of the client. Okay, well, a handle like this takes time, and I have to redo everything and like redesign things, go back to the sketchbook. So the creation of a work of art in modern times, well, actually since the time of the Renaissance probably, is a collaborative effort between the client, the customer, who has ideas, and the craftsman who has other ideas and actually has to make it. In creating unique works in a specific style, especially a style that is no longer alive in any meaningful sense. The people who developed it are long dead, and the ways of viewing the universe no longer exist. We no longer look at the world through the Copernican system or a system of sacredness hidden in everyday objects. We no longer use alchemy. We know about atoms. We know about light refraction. And the people in the medieval era never knew all of that. The glimpse of modern knowledge was so far away from them that the way they saw the world is more alien to us than the depiction of aliens in pop culture movies that we ourselves create. So in order to do them justice, you have to submerge yourself fully into their way of thinking, into their way of reading literature, into their way of listening to music and living. I am a trained art historian. I'm a trained philosopher. Those were my degrees. I've read medieval texts in translation, but nonetheless. And I try on this channel to bring that knowledge and that training to you, the viewer, for free on YouTube. And in my craft, I'm also a trained artist. I try to bring together various disciplines and present to you, once again, something that is of value. Now, if you don't like listening to interpretations of literature, into cool topics of theology, you can, in theory, put this entire video on mute, turn on your favorite Spotify soundtrack, and just watch it. But I'd like this channel to be somewhat different than other sword maker channels. We have experts on this channel that can talk about specific topics. For example, today's episode was a lot about Christian art and its foundation. Now, I will present the same amount of respect when we're dealing with Buddhist art, like a Tibetan sword or a piece of Japanese armor. In that case, we'll talk a lot about Shinto, we'll talk about Buddhism, esoteric Buddhism, and developing of the architecture, because those are necessary to understand holistically. The sword, the European sword, exists within a specific worldview in a specific context. It embeds itself in specific cultural expressions like architecture, like literature, music, and even day-to-day etiquette. So the hero is more than just a sword. It is a testament to my scholarship. It is a fingerprint of my art. It is a fingerprint of my vision and how I understand artistic expression itself. It is also a piece of literature that is embedded in the material. It is a piece of literature about what I've read. It is a piece of literature about what you see in my work. It is a piece of literature that reinterprets with a modern eye, but respect to people who came before me, the legend of St. George. The legend of St. George is iconic in the Christian warrior tradition. And it combines two worldviews already at the time of its creation. It combines the Roman and Greco-Roman pagan worldview about what it means to be a heroic warrior, but it also attaches a new way of thinking at the time, the Christian notion of righteousness and where does truth come from. And in creating a sword that combines these ideas and that seriously takes them and ponders them, I think you will enjoy the outcome. And any moment of me as an artist, like the aspect of the sword that you like, it came from that place. It came from a place of reading 5,000 pages of St. Augustine. It came from listening to lectures on Greek philosophy because I have to refresh them too. It was a long time since I got my degree. It is a moment of a creation of art, of something new. And in research, I was finding a lot of new things about very old things. And I think that's cool. And that's how I want this channel to be. Present new original work in a way that relates to the stuff you study in school, to the stuff you ignored reading and now would love to read and find out. YouTube is a wonderful place where you can find lectures by Harvard professors talking about very specific, very cool and obscure topics. And I'd like this video to be part of that library that when you come home tired, you still would like to learn more about the world where you live in. So with these words, I present to you the hero. Thank you for watching. This is the third and last sword in the triptych idea: the Inquisitor, the Heretic, and the Hero. If you like these long-form big project videos, be sure to check out the previous video, the Heretic, right here. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.